What truly happens in your soul when before Christmas you lean forward and kiss a crucifix? Not what many assume, not what is repeated out of custom during Advent rituals. According to Saint Teresa of Jesus, as the Church moves closer to the mystery of the Incarnation, that simple gesture can either open a deep interior work or remain entirely empty if it does not rise from the right place in the heart. She warned that the cross does not respond to the season, the candles, or the outward act, but to intention. Two people can kiss the same crucifix during these days before Christmas, at the same moment, with the same visible reverence, and yet in one soul something real is born, while in the other nothing happens at all. She said the body may bow, especially in sacred seasons, but the soul decides whether it will truly enter. This insight stands at the center of her teaching, because kissing a crucifix is not a festive habit, nor an automatic sign of faith intensified by Christmas. It is a silent language between the soul and God, a language that, if spoken without awareness, says nothing, but if spoken in truth, touches the deepest place of the person. Saint Teresa understood that the body prays, that the body believes, and that the body can also hide. That is why she insisted that religious gestures, even those repeated each December, when emptied of intention become routine, but when filled with truth become encounter. The cross is not neutral, it is a place of interior decision. She affirmed that the cross is not kissed with the lips, but with what one truly is. When a person approaches the crucifix in the days before Christmas, the soul is placed before an uncomfortable truth. Love that did not defend itself, sacrifice that did not flee, surrender that did not bargain. And that encounter always provokes an interior response, even if it goes unnoticed. Saint Teresa observed that very often the first movement when kissing the cross is resistance, not open rejection, but a subtle tightening within. Something holds back. Something protects itself. Something does not want to fully enter. She said the soul recognizes the cross before it accepts it, because the cross does not flatter the ego. It does not confirm self-sufficiency. It does not reassure pride, even when surrounded by Christmas devotion. That is why kissing it sincerely always implies an interior act of humility, however small, however brief. Saint Teresa taught this brief instant is enough. When the kiss offered before Christmas comes from humility, the soul descends not into guilt but into truth. It recognizes itself as limited, fragile, in need, and in that recognition, grace quietly begins. She affirmed that the soul that recognizes itself as small becomes a dwelling place for God. But when the kiss comes only from habit, even a holy seasonal habit, the soul does not descend. It passes by. The gesture is completed, but it does not touch. It does not transform. It awakens nothing. The saint warned that one of the greatest dangers of spiritual life is believing one has prayed simply because one has performed a gesture. Kissing a crucifix without entering the mystery of the cross, she said, is one of the clearest examples of this illusion. She insisted that a gesture without surrender does not move the soul. This is why not all kisses to the crucifix are the same. Some are expressions of true love. Others reflect a faith inherited but not yet assumed. Others become a way to quiet the conscience during holy seasons without allowing the heart to be changed. Saint Teresa did not speak this way to accuse, but to awaken, because she knew the human soul often hides in the visible when it fears the depth. She observed that many people kissed the cross before Christmas, seeking quick relief, immediate comfort, or a warm feeling of peace. But the cross, she said, is not meant first to console, but to order. It does not remove the weight. It gives it meaning. Here lies the heart of her teaching. Kissing the crucifix is not an escape from suffering, but communion with a love that passed through suffering without fleeing. That is why, when the soul approaches sincerely, something begins to move inside, even if nothing is felt. Saint Teresa noticed that after a true kiss to the crucifix, the soul often remains more exposed, less protected by excuses, more aware of itself. This nakedness is not weakness. It is openness. She said God enters when the soul stops defending itself. Thus, the kiss to the crucifix before Christmas is, at its core, a response, not a request, not a demand, but a silent answer to a love already given. When the soul responds in truth, the cross ceases to be an external symbol and becomes an interior mirror. It reveals what is ordered and what is not, what loves and what avoids, what trusts and what resists. Saint Teresa insisted that this mirror should not be feared, because it does not show in order to condemn, but to heal, though it heals only when the soul does not flee its reflection. She affirmed that the soul that looks at the cross learns to look at itself. This learning is slow. It is not achieved in a single Advent act. It is built through perseverance, sincerity, and humility. That is why this reality cannot be grasped superficially. In her further reflections, Saint Teresa explains what concrete movements occur within the soul, why some feel consolation during these holy days and others do not, and what interior disposition transforms this gesture into a true source of grace rather than an empty routine. Because kissing a crucifix before Christmas is not a small act. It is a door, and not everyone enters it in the same way. Saint Teresa taught that after the first sincere contact with the cross, the soul enters a very particular state, awakened awareness. It is not yet peace. It is not consolation. It is an interior clarity that can feel unsettling, because the cross does not lull the soul to sleep. It awakens it. She said the cross opens the eyes of the soul before it soothes the heart. When a person kisses the crucifix in truth during Advent, something becomes visible inside, not clear thoughts or tidy ideas, but a deep perception that something within is not fully aligned. Saint Teresa observed that this awakening often appears as a gentle restlessness, a quiet sorrow, or a denser interior silence than usual. It is not punishment. It is not guilt. It is light. She insisted that the light of the cross does not always console immediately, because it first reveals what needs to be ordered. When the soul sees itself, it reacts, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with fatigue, sometimes with an emotion it cannot name. She affirmed that God first shows what he desires to heal. That is why she warned not to flee when, after kissing the crucifix, the soul does not feel better right away. That moment may mark the beginning of a deeper work. Saint Teresa saw that the awakened soul begins to recognize its limits with greater clarity. It no longer relies on the image it has of itself, but on the truth revealed. This truth does not humiliate, but it does strip away illusions. She said the cross strips so that God may clothe. This interior stripping is not about losing something external, but about ceasing to rely on false securities, self-sufficiency, control, and the need to understand everything. The soul begins to accept that some things cannot be carried alone. This, she taught, is one of the greatest fruits of kissing the crucifix, the breaking of the illusion of control. Saint Teresa affirmed that suffering becomes unbearable when the soul insists on dominating it. But when it is placed in God's hands, the weight changes place. Pain weighs less when it is not carried alone. Kissing the crucifix with awareness before Christmas is an act of surrender, not of circumstances, but of the claim to control everything. That surrender produces an immediate effect. The soul stops its interior struggle. It does not give up. It gives itself. Saint Teresa observed that this surrender creates a silence unlike ordinary silence. It is not emptiness or absence, but a silence filled with presence, a silence that does not search for words. She said that when the soul falls silent before the cross, God begins to speak, not with phrases, but with interior movements, with subtle changes of vision, with a new patience. She saw that many people, after kissing the crucifix with faith during these days, began to accept their own fragility. They stopped demanding perfection from themselves. They stopped judging and comparing. She affirmed that the cross does not ask you to be strong, but to be true. That truth frees the soul from the exhausting burden of pretending it can handle everything. When the soul stops pretending, it rests. This rest is not emotional, but spiritual. Saint Teresa explained that this rest allows God to act freely, because God does not enter where the soul is crowded with noise, defenses, and explanations. He enters where there is space. She said God acts where the soul leaves room. After this awakening, the soul's relationship with pain begins to change. It no longer sees suffering only as something to escape before Christmas joy arrives, but as a place where God can be encountered. This does not mean seeking pain, but refusing to flee from it. Saint Teresa insisted that this learning is neither quick nor pleasant, but it is fruitful. The soul that does not flee becomes steadier, firmer, freer. She affirmed that the soul that does not flee does not break. This is one of the silent fruits of kissing the crucifix: interior stability. A stability not dependent on everything going well, but on knowing where to lean when everything trembles. She saw that this process unfolds gradually. Each sincere kiss to the crucifix awakens the soul again, strips it a little more, surrenders it a little further. It is not empty repetition. It is depth. She said, the cross does not tire the soul, fleeing from it does. In her continued teaching, Saint Teresa explains why some people experience immediate consolation when kissing the crucifix and others enter a prolonged interior silence, and how both belong to the same work of God. She taught that after the awakening brought by the cross, the soul often enters a misunderstood stage, the apparent absence of consolation. It is the moment when someone kisses the crucifix with faith, sincerity, even tears, and yet feels no relief. No peace comes, no emotion follows. For many this is confusing, but for Saint Teresa it is essential. She said that when God withdraws consolation, he does not depart, he draws nearer. This reveals one of her deepest teachings, because the soul often measures God's presence by feeling. When it feels nothing, it assumes God is absent. Teresa firmly rejected this idea. For her, kissing the crucifix is not an emotional exchange, but an act of naked faith, and faith grows when it does not depend on sensation. She affirmed that love that needs to feel is not yet free. That is why many souls experience dryness when kissing the cross, not because they err, but because God is educating their love. He teaches the soul to love without immediate reward. She saw this dryness not as punishment, but as purification, a purification of intention. The soul learns not to seek consolation, then the gesture, but to offer itself through it. She said God removes consolation so that it is not confused with him. This is crucial, because when one kisses the crucifix seeking feeling, the center remains the self. But when one kisses it without feeling and remains, the center shifts. Christ becomes central. Saint Teresa observed that this stage wounds spiritual pride. The soul can no longer say it prayed well or felt peace. It can only say it remained. And she said this is already much. Remaining without feeling is a high form of love. At this point, the kiss to the crucifix becomes fidelity rather than exchange. The soul stands before the cross, not to receive, but to be true. Saint Teresa saw that many abandon the practice here because it no longer seems to work. She warned that this abandonment robs the soul of deep growth. Trusting, she said, is not feeling, but remaining when nothing sustains emotionally. This dryness frees the soul from dependence on constant reassurance. It learns to rely on faith rather than experience. She affirmed that God desires children, not beggars for consolation. The kiss to the crucifix lived in this way forms the soul as few things can, making it steady, faithful, and quietly strong. Over time, she observed, these souls developed a silent strength. They did not speak much about their faith, nor seek extraordinary signs, but they persevered. They loved in ordinary life. She said the love tested in dryness is the love that does not break. And in this stage, the soul's understanding of suffering is purified. Pain is no longer something to escape before joy arrives, but something to surrender within God. The cross ceases to be a place kissed to flee pain, and becomes the place where pain is entrusted. Saint Teresa affirmed that the cross does not remove the weight, It teaches the soul how to carry it. And this teaching, Saint Teresa explains, does not unfold through emotion, but through time, through faithful repetition of the gesture, especially in the quiet days leading up to Christmas, through humility and patient perseverance. That is why she insisted that when the kiss to the crucifix produces no consolation, it should not be abandoned, but purified even more, made simpler, slower, truer. She advised not filling the moment with interior speeches, not searching for elevated thoughts, not forcing feelings, but simply being there, simply kissing, simply remaining. She said that when the soul no longer knows what to say, God is already at work, because the silence of the soul becomes fertile ground for grace. In that silence, something forms that is not immediately visible, the capacity to love without conditions. Saint Teresa observed that after passing through this stage, the soul no longer seeks God only when suffering or needing comfort, even during holy seasons, but begins to seek Him for who He is. And this change, she said, is decisive. Whoever loves God for God no longer loses their way. In her following reflections, Saint Teresa explains how this process protects the soul from one of the greatest dangers of spiritual life, allowing sacred gestures to slowly turn into empty habits, and how to prevent the kiss to the crucifix from losing its transformative power over time. She taught that after the stage of dryness, a subtle danger emerges that is not always recognized quickly: empty habit. Not the outward habit, because the gesture may still be performed faithfully even before Christmas, but the interior habit, when the soul is no longer truly present. She said that habit without awareness gently puts the soul to sleep. This danger does not appear suddenly. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. The kiss to the crucifix continues, but the heart no longer fully enters. The gesture is repeated out of inert, learned practice, outward reverence, but without deep interior participation. Saint Teresa saw this as one of the most common risks in spiritual life, continuing holy actions without allowing oneself to be touched by them. When this happens, the cross no longer awakens, no longer strips, no longer purifies. It becomes familiar, comfortable, harmless. She warned that the soul can even grow accustomed to God. This warning was not exaggerated. The human soul, she said, has an immense capacity to adapt to everything, even to what is sacred. When this adaptation occurs, the gesture loses its transforming power. The kiss to the crucifix, instead of being an encounter, becomes just another step. Something done because it has always been done. Something that calms the conscience during holy times, but no longer moves the heart. Saint Teresa insisted that God is not offended by weakness, but He is wounded by lack of truth, because truth alone allows grace to act. She said God does not ask for much. He asks that the soul not pretend, and pretending does not mean deliberate deception. It means acting as though the soul were present when it is not. It means kissing the cross while the heart is far away, scattered, closed, or simply absent. She observed that when the gesture empties, the soul begins to live a superficial faith, outwardly correct, compliant, but without depth. The cross no longer challenges, no longer unsettles, no longer orders. She said that when the cross no longer disturbs you, something inside has fallen asleep. Because the cross by its nature must always provoke something interior, not necessarily pain, but truth. If it provokes nothing, the problem is not the cross, but the soul's disposition. Saint Teresa did not advise abandoning the gesture in these moments. On the contrary, she proposed purifying it, perhaps doing it less often but with more awareness or power, using for a few seconds beforehand to allow the heart to catch up with the body. She offered very simple counsel. Do not rush the gesture, because haste is the enemy of interior life. When the kiss to the crucifix is done quickly, automatically, without pause, the soul has no time to enter. She said the soul enters when the gesture stops. That is why, for her, a small change was often enough. Taking the crucifix calmly, looking at it for a moment, remembering what it represents, and only then kissing it. That brief moment of awareness restores life to the gesture. Saint Teresa saw that when the soul recovers this awareness, the cross begins to speak again, not with words but with presence. It reveals again, it orders again, it awakens again. She affirmed that the cross never loses its power, it is the soul that stops opening. This point is essential, because the person should not accuse themselves harshly for falling into routine. Routine is not sin, it is human. But awakening, when one notices that the gesture no longer touches, is necessary. Saint Teresa taught that this awakening itself is already grace. Simply noticing that the gesture has emptied is a sign that God is acting. She said whoever notices their dryness is no longer asleep. That is why she insisted not to abandon the cross out of discouragement. To abandon it would be to flee. The right response is to return with humility, acknowledging that the soul has grown cold and asking for the grace to love again with simplicity. She observed that when a person does this, something loosens. The gesture becomes awkward again, uncertain, without emotion but true, and that is enough for God to act. She affirmed that God works with poor but sincere gestures. This process teaches the soul an essential lesson, that spiritual life is sustained not by intensity, but by fidelity, not by feeling much, but by being present when nothing is felt. Saint Teresa saw that after this purification of habit, the soul becomes more humble. It no longer relies on its own devotion. It no longer feels secure because it performs gestures. It learns to rely only on God. She said, true devotion is born when the soul stops relying on itself. This learning, she taught, is one of the deepest fruits of the kiss to the crucifix lived with perseverance. The gesture ceases to be an isolated act and becomes an interior school, a school of patience, truth, and humility. In her continued reflections, Saint Teresa explains what interior disposition definitively transforms this gesture into a constant source of grace, even within daily routine, and how the kiss to the crucifix begins to quietly reshape the way of living and loving. She taught that when the soul has passed through dryness and has been purified of empty habit, a new, silent, and stable disposition begins to form, trusting availability. It is no longer about feeling, understanding, or struggling inwardly. It is about being. She said the soul that offers itself without conditions no longer defends itself. This disposition is one of the deepest fruits of the kiss to the crucifix lived faithfully. The gesture stops belonging only to certain moments, such as prayer times or holy seasons, and begins to become an interior attitude that accompanies daily life. Saint Teresa observed that at this stage, the soul no longer approaches the cross seeking relief or answers. It approaches because it recognizes in it a safe place, a place where it no longer has to sustain itself. She affirmed that the cross is rest for the soul tired of supporting itself. This rest is not passivity or resignation, it is active trust. The soul learns to surrender what it cannot control, what it does not understand, what it cannot change. She saw that this learning profoundly transforms life. The person no longer reacts with the same anxiety to problems, not because they no longer matter, but because they have learned to place them elsewhere. She said the soul changes when its support changes. Before, the support was one's own strength, reason, or will. Now the support is God. This interior shift becomes visible in daily life, in the way of speaking, waiting, suffering, and loving. Saint Teresa observed that the kiss to the crucifix lived from this disposition begins to produce interior unity. The person stops living divided between belief and action, between words and life, not because everything is resolved, but because everything is offered. She affirmed that unity is born when the soul stops resisting. This unity does not eliminate contradictions, but it robs them of their power. The soul no longer tears itself apart trying to be perfect. It learns to walk with its limits without scandal. Saint Teresa saw that this process frees the soul from an enormous burden, the need to justify itself. The person no longer feels compelled to explain themselves to God, to others, or even to themselves. They simply present themselves. She said God does not need explanations, he needs truth. When the kiss to the crucifix is lived from this truth, it becomes a profoundly simple act. There are no grand thoughts, no intense emotions, only humble and real presence. She explained that this gesture, repeated in this way, gradually forms a rare virtue in the soul, interior meekness, not weakness, but meekness born of trust. She affirmed that the meek soul is not one that yields out of fear, but one that trusts without demanding. This meekness changes the way a person relates to others. They become less reactive, less defensive, less harsh, not because they have lost strength, but because they no longer need to protect themselves constantly. Saint Teresa saw this as a clear sign that the cross is at work. The cross does not harden, it softens without weakening. It removes roughness without removing firmness. This transformation is not produced by moral effort, but by interior communion with Christ. By kissing the cross with persevering faith, the soul slowly learns to look as Christ looks, to wait as Christ waits, to love as Christ loves. Saint Teresa insisted that this process is slow, very slow, but sure, because it depends not on mood or human will, but on grace. God does not work in haste. He works in depth. That is why she warned against demanding quick results. The kiss to the crucifix does not transform life in days, but in years. Yet what it transforms truly. She observed that at this point, the soul no longer measures its spiritual life by practices, sensations, or visible outcomes, but by fidelity, constancy, and silent surrender. She said the mature soul stops counting itself. This maturity is especially evident in the way suffering is lived. Pain is no longer seen as a constant threat, but as a reality that can be carried with meaning. She affirmed that suffering does not destroy the soul that trusts. For this reason, the kiss to the crucifix lived from this disposition becomes a silent source of strength. Not a strength that shouts, but one that sustains. Not a force that dominates, but one that remains. She saw that this strength does not make the soul invulnerable, but it makes it stable. It no longer collapses easily. It no longer despairs in darkness. It has learned to wait. She said, trusting and waiting is a form of love. This silent and faithful love prepares the soul for the final fruit of this path, deep peace, not as a passing feeling, but as a stable interior state. In the final reflection, Saint Teresa gathers this entire journey and shows what ultimately happens in the soul that perseveres in kissing the cross. True faith, and why this gesture, so small in appearance, ends by shaping the entire interior life. She taught that when the soul has learned to remain, to trust, and to stop demanding from itself, something new and very delicate begins to appear, a peace that does not depend on circumstances. It is not constant joy or absence of pain, but an interior stability that does not break easily. She said, true peace is not the absence of suffering, but not losing God within suffering. This is one of the deepest fruits of the kiss to the crucifix lived with persevering faith. The person no longer falls apart interiorly at every difficulty, not because it does not affect them, but because they have learned where to lean when everything shakes. Saint Teresa observed that this peace does not arrive suddenly, but as the result of a long process in which the soul is stripped, purified, educated, and sustained little by little. Nothing spectacular, nothing loud, but profoundly real. She affirmed that God makes no noise when forming a soul. This formation becomes visible in daily life. The soul reacts less hastily. It learns to wait before responding. It learns to be silent without resentment, to accept without resignation. Saint Teresa saw that the kiss to the crucifix repeated in truth sows this peace like a seed. At first it is unnoticed. Then it appears in small changes, a gentler response, unexpected patience, a new ability to endure without bitterness. She said peace is recognized by what changes quietly. This peace also transforms the soul's relationship with the past. Many live bound to old mistakes, unresolved guilt, wounds that remain open. Saint Teresa taught that the cross has a unique power to free the soul from this burden, not by erasing memory, but by healing the way one looks. She affirmed that the cross does not erase the past, it redeems it. When the soul kisses the crucifix with faith, it begins to understand that even what was painful can be surrendered, not justified or denied, but entrusted. Over time, she observed, the person stops defining themselves by failures or wounds and begins to define themselves by God's fidelity. This change is decisive. She said the soul heals when it stops looking only at itself. This peace also touches the relationship with the future. Fear weakens. It does not disappear, but it no longer rules. The person stops living in constant anticipation or control of what is to come. She affirmed that the soul that trusts does not live ahead of itself. This learning is among the most difficult, but also the most liberating, because the soul stops living stretched between what was and what will be. It begins to inhabit the present with greater serenity. The kiss to the crucifix lived from this maturity becomes an interior reaffirmation, not to ask for something specific, but to remember where the center is, and to place oneself there again. Saint Teresa perceived that when the soul reaches a certain maturity, it no longer needs to kiss the crucifix frequently in order to feel close to God. And yet, paradoxically, it continues to do so. Not because it needs consolation, but because it loves. She expressed this with a sentence of great spiritual clarity. When the gesture is no longer necessary, it becomes pure. At that point, the kiss is no longer a support for emotion, but a quiet expression of relationship. It no longer seeks something. It simply responds. For Saint Teresa, this was one of the clearest signs of authentic spiritual growth. The soul has ceased to cling and has learned to remain. The crucifix is no longer approached to be reassured, but to be faithful. She observed that when the soul arrives here, the cross begins to appear not only in prayer, but in life itself. The soul starts to reflect the crucified Christ in its way of living, in how it treats others, in how it endures injustice without bitterness, in how it forgives without noise or display. She affirmed that the cross is recognized not by words or gestures, but by a certain quality of love. The cross is recognized, she said, when the soul loves without noise. This love is not sentimental or fragile. It is firm, patient, and constant. It is born from having learned, again and again, to kiss the cross without fleeing, without bargaining, without demanding explanations. Saint Teresa was careful to clarify that this stage should not be confused with comfort or ease. The soul still experiences trials. It still passes through darkness, weariness, and inner nights. But it no longer loses its direction. The soul at peace, she wrote, can walk even in the night. And this ability to walk without light, sustained only by trust, is one of the greatest fruits of having lived the kiss to the crucifix with perseverance. Life does not always offer clarity, but it always offers the possibility of entrusting oneself. The soul that has learned this no longer depends on feelings to believe. Through interior experience, it has discovered that God remains faithful even when he is not felt. At this point, Saint Teresa said, the soul no longer needs many explanations to sustain its faith. It has crossed the cross, and therefore, it no longer doubts love. Whoever has passed through the cross, she affirmed, no longer doubts the love. This certainty is not loud or triumphant. It is silent, humble, and stable. It does not present itself as an idea, but as a conviction that sustains the entire spiritual life from within. She then explained that this simple and repeated gesture ends up shaping the whole interior world of the person. Kissing the crucifix with faith is not merely an act of devotion. It is a school that teaches the soul to love differently, to suffer differently, and to trust differently. When the soul learns to live supported by the cross, something happens that is not immediately perceived but marks a before and an after. The cross stops being only something one does and begins to become something one lives. The cross, she said, does not change what you do. It changes from where you do it. This is one of the most silent and profound fruits of fidelity. The person does not change overnight on the outside, But inside, something has been reordered. Priorities shift. Reactions soften. The gaze widens. Saint Teresa observed that those who have learned to kiss the cross truthfully begin to live with less interior urgency. They no longer feel the need to resolve everything immediately or to have instant answers. They have learned that many truths are only understood by walking. The mature soul, she said, stops demanding light for every step. This maturity becomes especially visible in the way the person loves. Love grows more patient, less possessive, less dependent. The soul no longer loves to fill its own emptiness, but to give itself. And this transformation, Saint Teresa insisted, can only be born from the cross, because the cross is the school of love that does not claim. Whoever kisses the cross with truth, she said, learns to love without appropriating. From here, relationships are slowly purified. The person stops constantly measuring whether they receive as much as they give. They learn to love even when they are not understood, to remain even when they are not reciprocated, not out of resignation, but out of interior freedom. This freedom does not accompany me from human strength. It comes from communion with the crucified Christ. By approaching the cross again and again, the soul gradually assimilates his way of loving, and this assimilation also transforms the way suffering is lived. Pain is no longer interpreted as a personal injustice that must be explained or resisted at all costs. It becomes part of the human path that can be walked with meaning. The soul formed by the cross does not dramatize suffering, but neither does it deny it. It lives it with sobriety, depth, and truth. The soul formed by the cross, Saint Teresa said, is not scandalized by pain. This teaching produces a deep interior freedom. The person stops fleeing from themselves. They accept their history, their limits, and the fact that not everything can be changed, but everything can be offered. What is not offered, she affirmed, ends up weighing. For this reason, the kiss to the crucifix becomes a gesture that accompanies life itself, not only moments of prayer. The soul learns to kiss the cross in waiting, in unjust words, in losses that were not chosen. The cross is not only on the altar, she said, it is in life. Another fruit of this path is interior coherence. The person no longer lives divided between what they believe and what they do, not because they are perfect, but because they have stopped pretending. The sincere soul, Saint Teresa said, contradicts itself less. The cross teaches sincerity. It teaches the soul to stop wearing spiritual masks and to present itself as it truly is. When the soul reaches this stage, faith becomes simpler and deeper at the same time. It no longer needs many words. It does not seek to impress or convince. It simply lives. Mature faith, she said, is seen more in life than in speech. This silent faith is one of the greatest gifts the kiss to the crucifix can leave in the soul. It does not depend on moods, favorable circumstances, or extraordinary experiences. Pain still comes, night still falls, weariness still weighs. But the soul no longer gets lost. The soul that has learned the cross, she affirmed, knows where to return. It always returns to the same place: surrender, trust, humility. In her final reflection, Saint Teresa gathered this entire journey and revealed what ultimately happens to the soul that perseveres. After truth, dryness, purification, trust, peace, and coherence, something occurs that no longer needs explanation. The soul becomes a home for the cross, she said. The cross stops visiting you when you decide to live in it. This did not mean a life of constant suffering, but a profound transformation. The cross is no longer approached occasionally. It is carried within as a way of living, loving, and trusting. From this place, the person no longer reacts from fear, wounds, or demands, but from surrender. The transformed soul, she said, no longer asks so much why, but for what purpose, and that change of question changes everything. Pain becomes a place of love. Difficulty becomes an occasion for fidelity. The cross is no longer only something kissed. It becomes a way of being in the world. This is the culmination of the entire path. The kiss to the crucifix, which began as a simple gesture, ends by teaching the soul not to get lost, even in darkness. The free soul, St. Teresa affirmed, is not the one that does not suffer, but the one that does not lose itself. This freedom is not achieved by effort, but by abandonment, by returning again and again, by remaining even without understanding. She concluded by reminding that no one ever kisses the cross in vain, even when nothing is felt, even when nothing is understood. The cross always leaves a mark. The soul that touches the cross, she said, never returns the same. There is no spectacle, no magic, only transformation, slow, silent, and real. And this is what happens to the soul when it kisses a crucifix with true faith.